Section 24 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost Seers, by Catherine Crowe. Chapter 16, The Poltergeist of the Germans, and Possession, Part 1. With regard to the so-called hauntings, referred to in the preceding chapter, there seems reason to believe that the invisible guest was formerly a dweller upon earth, in the flesh, who is prevented by some circumstance which we are not qualified to explain, from pursuing the destiny of the human race, by entering freely into the next state prepared for him. He is like an unfortunate caterpillar that cannot entirely free itself from the integuments of its reptile life which chain it to the earth, while its fluttering wings vainly seek to bear it into the region to which it now belongs. But there is another kind of haunting, which is still more mysterious and strange, though by no means unfrequent, and which, from the odd, sportive, mischievous nature of the disturbances created, one can scarcely reconcile to our notions of what we understand by the term ghost. For in those cases where the unseen visitant appears to be the spirit of a person deceased, we see evidences of grief, remorse, and dissatisfaction, together with, in many instances, a disposition to repeat the acts of life, or at least to simulate a repetition of them. But there is nothing sportive or mischievous, nor, except where an injunction is disobeyed or a request refused, are there generally any evidences of anger or malignity. But in the other cases alluded to, the annoyances appear rather like the tricks of a mischievous imp. I refer to what the Germans call the Poltergeist, or racketing spectre, for the phenomenon is known in all countries, and has been known in all ages. Since hearing of the phenomenon of the electric girl, which attracted so much attention and occasioned so much controversy in Paris lately, and other similar cases which have since reached me, I feel doubtful whether some of these strange circumstances may not have been connected with electricity in one form or another. The famous story of what is familiarly called the Stockwell ghost, for example, might possibly be brought under this category. I have heard some people assert that the mystery of this affair was subsequently explained away, and the whole found to be a trick. But that is a mistake. Some years ago I was acquainted with persons whose parents were living on the spot at that time, who knew all the details, and to them it remained as great a mystery as ever. Not the slightest light had ever been thrown upon it. People are so glad to get rid of troublesome mysteries of this description, that they are always ready to say, "The trick has been found out," and those who pride themselves on not believing idle stories are to the last degree credulous when the idle story flatters their skepticism. The circumstances of the so-called Stockwell ghost, which I extract from a report published at the time, are as follows. The pamphlet was entitled An Authentic, Candid, and Circumstantial Narrative of the Astonishing Transactions at Stockwell, in the County of Surrey, on Monday and Tuesday, the 6th and 7th days of January, 1772, containing a series of the most surprising and unaccountable events that ever happened, which continued, from first to last, upward of 20 hours, and at different places, published with the consent and approbation of the family and other parties concerned, to authenticate which the original copy is signed by them. Before we enter upon a description of the most extraordinary transactions that perhaps ever happened, We shall begin with an account of the parties who were principally concerned, and, in justice to them, give their characters, by which means the impartial world may see what credit is due to the following narrative. The events, indeed, are of so strange and singular a nature, that we cannot be at all surprised the public should be doubtful of the truth of them, more especially as there have been too many impositions of this sort. But, let us consider, here are no sinister ends to be answered, no contributions to be wished for, nor would be accepted, as the parties are in reputable situations and good circumstances, particularly Mrs. Golding, who is a lady of an independent fortune. Richard Fowler and his wife might be looked upon as an exception to this assertion, but as their loss was trivial, they must be left out of the question, except so far as they appear corroborating evidences. Mr. Payne's maid lost nothing. How or by what means these transactions were brought about has never transpired. We have only to rest our confidence on the veracity of the parties, whose descriptions have been most strictly attended to, without the least deviation. Nothing here offered is either exaggerated or diminished. The whole stated in the clearest manner, just as they occurred. As such, only we lay them before the candid and impartial public. Mrs. Golding, an elderly lady at Stockwell, in Surrey, at whose house the transactions began, was born in the same parish, Lambeth, has lived in it ever since, and has always been well known and respected as a gentlewoman of unblemished honor and character. Mrs. Payne, a niece of Mrs. Golding, has been married several years to Mr. Payne, a farmer, at Brixton Causeway, a little above Mr. Angel's, has several children, and is well known and respected in the parish. Mary Martin, Mr. Payne's servant, an elderly woman, has lived 2 years with them and 4 years with Mrs. Golding, where she came from. Richard Fowler lives almost opposite to Mr. Payne at the Brick Pound, an honest, industrious, and sober man, and Sarah Fowler, wife to the above, is an industrious and sober woman. These are the subscribing evidences that we must rest the truth of the facts upon. Yet there are numbers of other persons who were eyewitnesses of many of the transactions during the time they happened, all of whom must acknowledge the truth of them. Another person who bore a principal part of these scenes was Anne Robinson, Mrs. Golding's maid, a young woman about 20 years old, who had lived with her but 1 week and 3 days. So much for the historiae personae, and now for the narrative. On Monday, January the 6th, 1772, about 10 o'clock in the forenoon, as Mrs. Golding was in her parlor, she heard the china and glasses in the back kitchen tumble down and break. Her maid came to her, and told her the stone plates were falling from the shelf. Mrs. Golding went into the kitchen and saw them broke. Presently after, a row of plates from the next shelf fell down likewise, while she was there, and nobody near them. This astonished her much, and while she was thinking about it, other things in different places began to tumble about, some of them breaking, attended with violent noises all over the house. A clock tumbled down, and the case broke. A lantern that hung on the staircase was thrown down, and the glass broke into pieces. An earthen pan of salted beef broke to pieces, and the beef fell about. All this increased her surprise, and brought several persons about her, among whom was Mr. Rowledge, a carpenter, who gave it as his opinion that the foundation was giving way and that the house was tumbling down, occasioned by the too great weight of an additional room erected above. So ready are we to discover natural causes for everything. But no such thing happened, as the reader will find, For whatever was the cause, that caused ceased almost as soon as Mrs. Golding and her maid left any place, and followed them wherever they went. Mrs. Golding ran into Mr. Gresham's house, a gentleman living next door to her, where she fainted. In the interim, Mr. Rowledge and other persons were removing Mrs. Golding's effects from her house, for fear of the consequences he had prognosticated. At this time all was quiet. Mrs. Golding's maid, remaining in the house, was gone upstairs, and when called upon several times to come down, for fear of the dangerous situation she was thought to be in, she answered very coolly, and after some time came down as deliberately, without any seeming fearful apprehensions. Mrs. Payne was sent for from Brixton Causeway, and desired to come directly, as her aunt was supposed to be dead. This was the message to her. When Mrs. Payne came, Mrs. Golding was come to herself, but very faint. Among the persons who were present was Mr. Gardiner, a surgeon of Clapham, whom Mrs. Payne desired to bleed her aunt, which he did. Mrs. Payne asked him if the blood should be thrown away. He desired it might not, as he would examine it when cold. These minute particulars would not be taken notice of, but as a chain to what follows. For the next circumstance is of a more astonishing nature than anything that had preceded it. The blood that was just congealed sprang out of the basin upon the floor, and presently after the basin broke to pieces. This china basin was the only thing broke belonging to Mr. Gresham. A bottle of rum that stood by it broke at the same time. Among the things that were removed to Mr. Gresham's was a tray full of china, a Japan bread-basket, some mahogany waiters, and some bottles of liquors, jars of pickles, etc., and a pier-glass, which was taken down by Mr. Saville, a neighbor of Mrs. Golding's. He gave it to one Robert Hames, who laid it on the grass-plat at Mr. Gresham's, but, before he could put it out of his hands, some parts of the frame on each side flew off. It rained at that time. Mrs. Golding desired it might be brought into the parlor, where it was put under a sideboard, and a dressing-glass along with it. It had not been there long, before the glasses and china, which stood on the sideboard, began to tumble about and fall down, and broke both the glasses to pieces. Mr. Saville and others, being asked to drink a glass of wine or rum, both the bottles broke in pieces before they were uncorked. Mrs. Golding's surprise and fear increasing, she did not know what to do, or where to go. Wherever she and her maid were, these strange, destructive circumstances followed her, and how to help or free herself from them was not in her power, or any other person's present. Her mind was one confused chaos, lost to herself and everything about her, drove from her own home, and afraid there would be no other to receive her. At last she left Mr. Gresham's, and went to Mr. Mayling's, a gentleman at the next door. Here she stayed about 3/4 of an hour, during which time nothing happened. Her maid stayed at Mr. Gresham's, to put up what few things remained unbroken of her mistress's, in a back apartment, when a jar of pickles that stood upon a table turned upside down. Then a jar of raspberry jam broke to pieces. Next, 2 mahogany waiters and a quadrille box likewise broke in pieces. Mrs. Payne, not choosing her aunt should stay too long at Mr. Mayling's, for fear of being troublesome, persuaded her to go to her house at Rush Common, near Brixton Causeway, where she would endeavor to make her as happy as she could, hoping by this time all was over, as nothing had happened at that gentleman's house while she was there. This was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Mr. and Miss Gresham were at Mr. Payne's house, when Mrs. Payne, Mrs. Golding, and her maid went there. It being about dinner time, they all dined together. In the interim, Mrs. Golding's servant was sent to her house to see how things remained. When she returned, she told them nothing had happened since they left it. Some time after, Mr. Gresham and Miss went home, everything remaining quiet at Mr. Payne's. But about 8 o'clock in the evening, a fresh scene began. The first thing that happened was, a whole row of pewter dishes, except one, fell from off a shelf to the middle of the floor, rolled about a little while, then settled, and, what is almost beyond belief, as soon as they were quiet, turned upside down. They were then put on the dresser, and went through the same a second time. Next fell a whole row of pewter plates from off the second shelf over the dresser to the ground, and being taken up and put on the dresser one in another, they were thrown down again. The next thing was, 2 eggs that were upon one of the pewter shelves, one of them flew off, crossed the kitchen, struck a cat on the head, and then broke in pieces. Next, Mary Martin, Mrs. Payne's servant, went to stir the kitchen fire. She got to the right-hand side of it, being a large chimney, as is usual in farmhouses. A pestle and mortar that stood near the left-hand end of the chimney shelf jumped about 6 feet on the floor. Then went candlesticks and other brasses, scarcely anything remaining in its place. After this, the glasses and china were put down on the floor for fear of undergoing the same fate. They presently began to dance and tumble about, and then broke to pieces. A teapot that was among them flew to Mrs. Golding's maid's foot, and struck it. A glass tumbler that was put on the floor jumped about 2 feet, and then broke. Another that stood by it jumped about at the same time, but did not break till some hours after, when it jumped again, and then broke. A china bowl that stood in the parlor jumped from the floor to behind a table that stood there. This was most astonishing, as the distance from where it stood was between 7 and 8 feet, but was not broke. It was put back by Richard Fowler to its place, where it remained for some time, and then flew to pieces. The next thing that followed was a mustard pot, that jumped out of a closet and was broke. A single cup that stood upon the table, almost the only thing remaining, jumped up, flew across the kitchen, ringing like a bell, and then was dashed to pieces against the dresser. A candlestick that stood on the chimney shelf flew across the kitchen to the parlor door, at about 15 feet distance. A tea kettle, under the dresser, was thrown out about 2 feet. Another kettle, that stood at one end of the range, was thrown against the iron that is fixed to prevent children from falling into the fire. A tumbler with rum and water in it, that stood upon a waiter upon a table in the parlor, jumped about 10 feet, and was broke. The table then fell down, and along with it a silver tankard belonging to Mrs. Golding, the waiter in which stood the tumbler and a candlestick. A case bottle then flew to pieces. The next circumstance was, a ham that hung in one side of the kitchen chimney raised itself from the hook and fell down to the ground. Some time after, another ham that hung on the other side of the chimney likewise underwent the same fate. Then a flitch of bacon, which hung up in the same chimney, fell down. All the family were eye-witnesses to these circumstances, as well as other persons, some of whom were so alarmed and shocked that they could not bear to stay, and were happy in getting away, though the unhappy family were left in the midst of their distresses. Most of the genteel families around were continually sending to inquire after them, and whether all was over or not. Is it not surprising that some among them had not the inclination and resolution to try to unravel this most intricate affair, at a time when it would have been in their power to have done so? There certainly was sufficient time for so doing, as the whole, from first to last, continued upward of 20 hours. At all the times of action, Mrs. Golding's servant was walking backward and forward in either the kitchen or parlor, or wherever some of the family happened to be. Nor could they get her to sit down 5 minutes together, except at one point, for about half an hour toward the morning, when the family were at prayers in the parlor. Then all was quiet. But in the midst of the greatest confusion, she was as much composed as at any other time, and with uncommon coolness of temper advised her mistress not to be alarmed or uneasy, as she said these things could not be helped. Thus she argued, as if they were common occurrences, which must happen in every family. This advice surprised and startled her mistress, almost as much as the circumstances that occasioned it. For how can we suppose that a girl of about 20 years old, an age when female timidity is too often assisted by superstition, could remain in the midst of such calamitous circumstances, except they proceed from causes best known to herself, and not be struck with the same terror as every other person was who was present? These reflections led Mr. Payne, and, at the end of the transactions, likewise Mrs. Golding, to think that she was not altogether so unconcerned as she appeared to be, but, hitherto, the whole remains mysterious and unrivalled. About 10 o'clock at night, they sent over the way to Richard Fowler, to desire he would come and stay with them. He came and continued till 1 in the morning, and was so terrified that he could remain no longer. As Mrs. Golding could not be persuaded to go to bed, Mrs. Payne, at that time, 1 o'clock, made an excuse to go upstairs to her youngest child, under pretence of getting it to sleep. But she really acknowledges it was through fear, as she declares she could not sit up to see such strange things going on, as everything, one after another, was broke, till there was not above 2 or 3 cups and saucers remaining out of a considerable quantity of china, which was destroyed to the amount of some pounds. About 5 o'clock on Tuesday morning, Mrs. Golding went up to her niece, and desired her to get up, as the noises and destruction were so great. She could continue in the house no longer. At this time all the tables, chairs, drawers, etc., were tumbling about. When Mrs. Payne came down, it was amazing beyond all description. Their only security then was to quit the house, for fear of the same catastrophe as had been expected the morning before at Mrs. Golding's. In consequence of this resolution, Mrs. Golding and her maid went over the way to Richard Fowler's. When Mrs. Golding's maid had seen her safe to Richard Fowler's, she came back to Mrs. Payne, to help her to dress the children in the barn, where she had carried them for fear of the house falling. At this time all was quiet. They then went to Fowler's, and then began the same scene as had happened at the other places. It must be remarked, all was quiet here, as well as elsewhere, till the maid returned. When they got to Mr. Fowler's, he began to light a fire in his back room. When done, he put the candle and candlestick upon a table in the foreroom. This apartment Mrs. Golding and her maid had passed through. Another candlestick, with a tin lamp in it, that stood by it, were both dashed together, and fell to the ground. A lantern, with which Mrs. Golding was lighted across the road, sprang from a hook to the ground, and a quantity of oil spilled on the floor. The last thing was, the basket of coals tumbled over, the coals rolling about the room. The maid then desired Richard Fowler not to let her mistress remain there, as she said wherever she was the same things would follow. In consequence of this advice, and fearing greater losses to himself, he desired she would quit his house, but first begged her to consider within herself, for her own and the public's sake, whether or not she had been guilty of some atrocious crime, for which Providence was determined to pursue her on this side of the grave. For he could not help thinking she was the object that was to be made an example to posterity, by the all-seeing eye of Providence, for crimes which but too often none but that Providence can penetrate, and by such means as these bring to light. Thus was the poor gentlewoman's measure of affliction complete, not only to have undergone all which has been related, but to have added to it the character of a bad and wicked woman, when till this time she was esteemed as a most deserving person. In candor to Fowler, he could not be blamed. What could he do? What would any man have done that was so circumstanced? Mrs. Golding soon satisfied him. She told him she would not stay in his house or any other person's, as her conscience was quite clear, and she could as well wait the will of Providence in her own house as in any other place whatever, upon which she and her maid went home. Mr. Payne went with them. After they had got to Mrs. Golding's the last time, the same transactions once more began upon the remains that were left. A 9-gallon cask of beer that was in the cellar, the door being open, and no person near it, turned upside down. A pail of water that stood on the floor boiled like a pot. A box of candles fell from a shelf in the kitchen to the floor. They rolled out, but none were broke, and a round mahogany table overset in the parlor. Mr. Payne then desired Mrs. Golding to send her maid for his wife to come to them. When she was gone, all was quiet. Upon her return, she was immediately discharged, and no disturbances have happened since. This was between 6 and 7 o'clock on Tuesday morning. At Mrs. Golding's were broke the quantities of 3 pailfuls of glass, china, etc. At Mrs. Payne's they filled 2 pails. Thus ends the narrative, a true, circumstantial, and faithful account, of which we have laid before the public, and have endeavored, as much as possible, throughout the whole, to state only facts, without presuming to obtrude any opinion on them. If we have in part hinted anything that may appear unfavorable to the girl, it is not from a determination to charge her with the cause, right or wrong, but only from a strict adherence to truth, most sincerely wishing this extraordinary affair may be unraveled. The above narrative is absolutely and strictly true, in witness whereof we have set our hands this 11th day of January, 1772, Mary Golding, John Payne, Mary Payne, Richard Fowler, Sarah Fowler, Mary Martin. The original copy of this narrative, signed as above, with the party's own hands, was put into the hands of Mr. Marks, bookseller, in St. Martin's Lane, to satisfy persons who choose to inspect the same. Such phenomena as this of the Stockwell ghost are by no means uncommon, and I am acquainted with many more instances than I can allude to here. One occurred very lately in the neighborhood of London, as I learned from the following newspaper paragraph. I subsequently heard that the little girl had been sent away, but whether the phenomena then ceased, or whether she carried the disturbance with her, I have not been able to ascertain, nor does it appear certain that she had anything to do with it. A mischievous and mysterious ghost, from a correspondent. The whole of the neighborhood of Black Lion Lane, Bayswater, is ringing with the extraordinary occurrences that have recently happened in the house of a Mr. Williams, on the Moscow road, in which bear a strong resemblance to the celebrated Stockwell ghost affair in 1772. The house is inhabited by Mr. and Mrs. Williams, a grown-up son and daughter, and a little girl between 10 and 11 years of age. On the first day, the family, who are remarkable for their piety, were startled all at once by a mysterious movement among the things in the sitting rooms and kitchen, and other parts of the house. At one time, without any visible agency, one of the jugs came off the hook over the dresser and was broken. Then followed another, and next day another. A china teapot, with the tea just made in it, and placed on the mantelpiece, whisked off onto the floor, and was smashed. A pewter one, which had been substituted immediately after, did the same, and when put on the table, was seen to hop about as if bewitched, and was actually held down while the tea was made for Mr. William's breakfast, before leaving for his place of business. When for a time all had been quiet, off came from its place on the wall a picture in a heavy gilt frame and fell to the floor without being broken. All was now amazement and terror, for the old people are very superstitious, and ascribing it to a supernatural agency, the other pictures were removed and stowed away on the floor. But the spirit of locomotion was not to be arrested. Jugs and plates continued at intervals to quit their posts and skip off their hooks and shelves into the middle of the room, as though they were inspired by the magic flute, and at supper, when the little girl's mug was filled with beer, the mug slided off the table onto the floor. 3 times it was replaced, and 3 times it moved off again. It would be tedious to relate the fantastic tricks which have been played by household articles of every kind. An Egyptian vase jumped off the table suddenly, when no soul was near, and was smashed to pieces. The tea kettle popped off the fire into the grate as Mr. Williams had filled the teapot, which fell off the chimney-piece. Candlesticks, after a dance on the table, flew off, and ornaments from the shelves, and bonnets, and cap-boxes flung about in the oddest manner. A looking-glass hopped off a dressing-table, followed by combs and brushes and several bottles, and a great pincushion has been remarkably conspicuous for its incessant jigs from one part to another. The little girl, who is a Spaniard, and under the care of Mr. and Mrs. Williams, is supposed by their friends to be the cause of it all, however extraordinary it may seem in one of her age, but up to the present time it continues a mystery, and the modus operandi is invisible. Morning Post. To imagine that these extraordinary effects were produced by the voluntary agency of the child furnishes one of those remarkable instances of the credulity of the skeptical to which I have referred. But when we read a true statement of the effects involuntarily exhibited by Angelique Cottin, we begin to see that it is just possible the other strange phenomena may be provided by a similar agency. The French Academy of Sciences had determined, as they had formerly done by mesmerism, that the thing should not be true. Monsieur Arago was nonsuited, but although it is extremely possible that either the phenomenon had run its course and arrived at a natural termination, or that the removal of the girl to Paris had extinguished it, there appears no doubt that it had previously existed. Angelique Cottin was a native of La Perrière, aged 14, when, on the 15th of January, 1846, at 8 o'clock in the evening, while wearing silk gloves at an oaken frame, in company with other girls, the frame began to jerk, and they could not by any efforts keep it steady. It seemed as if it were alive, and becoming alarmed, they called in the neighbors, who would not believe them, but desired them to sit down and go on with their work. Being timid, they went one by one, and the frame remained still till Angelique approached, when it recommenced its movements, while she was also attracted by the frame. Thinking she was bewitched or possessed, her parents took her to the presbytery, that the spirit might be exorcised. The curate, however, being a sensible man, refused to do it, but set himself, on the contrary, to observe the phenomenon, and being perfectly satisfied of the fact, he bade them take her to a physician. Meanwhile, the intensity of the influence, whatever it was, augmented. Not only articles made of oak, but all sorts of things were acted upon by it, and reacted upon her, while persons who were near her, even without contact, frequently felt electric shocks. The effects, which were diminished when she was on a carpet or a waxed cloth, were most remarkable when she was on the bare earth. They sometimes entirely ceased for 2 or 3 days, and then recommenced. Metals were not affected. Anything touched by her apron or dress would fly off, although a person held it, and Monsieur Hebert, while seated on a heavy tub or trough, was raised up with it. In short, the only place she could repose on was a stone covered with cork. They also kept her still by isolating her. When she was fatigued, the effects diminished. A needle suspended horizontally oscillated rapidly with the motion of her arm without contact, or remained fixed while deviating from the magnetic direction. Great numbers of enlightened medical and scientific men witnessed these phenomena and investigated them with every precaution to prevent imposition. She was often hurt by the violent involuntary movements she was thrown into, and was evidently afflicted by chorea. Unfortunately, her parents, poor and ignorant, insisted, much against the advice of the doctors, on exhibiting her for money, and under these circumstances she was brought to Paris, and nothing is more probable than that after the phenomena had really ceased, the girl may have been induced to simulate what had originally been genuine. The thing avowedly ceased altogether on the 10th of April, and there has been no return of it. In 1831, a young girl, also aged 14, who lived as under nursery maid in a French family, exhibited the same phenomena, and when the case of Angelique Cottin was made public, her master published hers. He says the things of such an extraordinary nature occurred as he dare not repeat, since none but an eyewitness could believe them. The thing lasted for 3 years, and there was ample time for observation. In the year 1686, a man at Brussels, called Breekmans, was similarly affected. A commission was appointed by the magistrates to investigate his condition, and, being pronounced a sorcerer, he would have been burnt, had he not luckily made his escape. Many somnambulic persons are capable of giving an electric shock, and I have met with one person, not somnambulic, who informs me that he has frequently been able to do it by an effort of the will. Dr. Ennemosher relates the case of Mademoiselle Emmerich, sister to the professor of theology at Strasbourg, who also possessed this power. This young lady, who appears to have been a person of very rare merit and endowments, was afflicted with a long and singular malady, originating in a fright, in the course of which she exhibited many very curious phenomena, having fallen into a state of natural somnambulism, accompanied by a high degree of lucidity. Her body became surcharged with electricity, that it was necessary to her relief to discharge it, and she sometimes imparted a complete battery of shocks to her brother and her physician, or whoever was near her, and that frequently when they did not touch her. Professor Emmerich mentions also that she sent him a smart shock one day when he was several rooms off. He started up and rushed into her chambers, where she was in bed, and as soon as she saw him, she said, laughing, "Ah, you felt it, did you?" Mademoiselle Emmerich's illness terminated in death. Cotugno, a surgeon, relates that, having touched with his scalpel the intercostal nerve of a mouse that had bitten his leg, he received an electric shock. And where the torpedo abounds, the fishermen, in pouring water over the fish they have caught for the purpose of washing them, know if one is among them by the shock they sustain. A very extraordinary circumstance, which we may possibly attribute to some influence as the above, occurred at Rambouillet in November, 1846. The particulars are furnished by a gentleman residing on the spot at the time, and were published by the Baron Dupotel, who, however, attempts no explanation of the mystery. One morning some travelling merchants or peddlers came to the door of a farmhouse belonging to a man named Botel, and asked for some bread, which the maidservant gave them, and they went away. Subsequently, one of the party returned to ask for more, and was refused. The man, I believed, expressed some resentment and uttered vague threats, but she would not give him anything, and he departed. That night at supper the plates began to dance and roll off the table, without any visible cause, and several other unaccountable phenomena occurred, and the girl, going to the door and chancing to place herself just where the peddler had stood, she was seized with convulsions and an extraordinary rotatory motion. The carter who was standing by laughed at her, and out of bravado placed himself on the same spot, when he felt almost suffocated, and was so unable to command his movements that he was overturned into a large pool in front of the house. Upon this they rushed to the curé of the parish for assistance, but he had scarcely said a prayer or two before he was attacked in the same manner, though in his own house, and his furniture began to oscillate and crack as if it were bewitched. The poor people were frightened out of their wits. By and by the phenomena intermitted, and they hoped all was over, but presently it began again, and this occurred more than once before it subsided wholly. On the 8th December, 1836, at Stuttgart, Carl Fischer, a baker's boy, aged 17, of steady habits and good character, was fixed with a basket on his shoulders, in some unaccountable way, in front of his master's house. He foresaw the thing was to happen, when he went out with his bread very early in the morning, earnestly wished that the day was over, and told his companion that if he could only cross the threshold on his return, he should escape it. It was about 6 when he did return, and his master, hearing a fearful noise which he could not describe, as if proceeding from a multitude of beings, looked out of the window, where he saw Carl violently struggling and fighting with his apron, though his feet were immovably fixed to one spot. A hissing sound proceeded from his mouth and nose, and a voice, which was neither his nor that of any person present, was heard to cry, "Stand fast, Carl!" The master says that he could not have believed such a thing, and he was so alarmed that he did not venture into the street, where numerous persons were assembled. The boy said he must remain there till 11 o'clock, and the police kept guard over him till that time, as the physician said he must not be interfered with, and the people sought to push him from the spot. When the time had expired, he was carried to the hospital, where he seemed exceedingly exhausted, and fell into a profound sleep. I meet with extraordinary records of a preternatural ringing of all the bells in a house, sometimes occurring periodically for a considerable time, and continuing after precautions have been taken, which precluded the possibility of trick or deception, the wires being cut, and vigilant eyes watching them, and yet they rung on, by day or night, just the same. It is certainly very difficult to conceive, but at the same time it is not impossible, that such strange phenomena as that of the Stockwell ghost, and many similar ones, may be the manifestations of some extraordinary electrical influence. But there are other cases of poltergeist, which it is impossible to attribute to the same cause, since they are accompanied by evident manifestations of will and intelligence. Such was the instance related in Southey's Life of Wesley, which occurred in the year 1716, beginning with a groaning, and subsequently proceeding to all manner of noises, lifting of latches, clattering of windows, knockings of a most mysterious kind, etc. The family were not generally frightened, but the young children, when asleep, showed symptoms of great terror. This annoyance lasted, I think, 2 or 3 months, and then ceased. As in most of these cases, the dog was extremely frightened, and hid himself when the visitations commenced. In the year 1838, a circumstance of the same kind occurred in Paris, in the Rue Saint-Honoré, and not very long ago there was one in Caithness, in which most unaccountable circumstances transpired. Among the rest, stones were flung, which never hit people, but fell at their feet, in rooms perfectly closed on all sides. A gentleman who witnessed these extraordinary phenomena related the whole story to an advocate of my acquaintance, who assured me that, however impossible he found it to credit such things, he should certainly place entire reliance on that gentleman's word in any other case. Then there is the famous story of the drummer of Tedworth, and the persecution of Professor Schuppert at Gießen, in Upper Hesse, which continued, with occasional intermission, for 6 years. This affair began with a violent knocking at the door one night. Next day stones were sent whizzing through closed rooms in all directions, so that, although no one was struck, the windows were all broken, and no sooner were new panes put in than they were broken again. He was persecuted with slaps on the face, by day and by night, so that he could get no rest, and when 2 persons were appointed by the authorities to sit by his bed to watch him, they got the slaps also. When he was reading at his desk, his lamp would suddenly rise up and remove to the other end of the room, not as if thrown, but evidently carried. His books were torn to pieces and flung at his feet, and when he was lecturing, this mischievous sprite would tear out the leaf he was reading, and it is very remarkable that the only thing that seemed available as a protection was a drawn sword brandished over his head by himself or others, which was one of the singularities attending the case of the drummer of Tedworth. Schuppert narrated all these circumstances in his public lectures, and nobody ever disputed the facts. A remarkable case of this sort occurred in the year 1670 at Keppoch, near Glasgow. There, also, stones were thrown which hit nobody, but the annoyance only continued 8 days, and there are several more to be found recorded in works of that period. The disturbance that happened in the house of Gilbert Campbell, at Glenluce, excited considerable notice. Here, as elsewhere, stones were thrown, but, as in most similar instances I meet with, no human being was damaged. The license of these spirits or goblins, or whatever they be, seeming to extend no further than worrying and tormenting their victims. In this case, however, the spirit spoke to them, though he was never seen. The annoyance commenced in November of the year 1654, I think, and continued till April, when there was some intermission till July, when it recommenced. The loss of the family from the things destroyed was ruining, for their household goods and chattels were rendered useless, their food was polluted and spoiled, and their very clothes cut to pieces while on their backs, by invisible hands, and it was in vain that all the ministers about the country assembled to exorcise this troublesome spirit, for whoever was there, the thing continued exactly the same. At length poor Campbell applied to the Synod of Presbyters for advice, and a meeting was convened in October 1655, and a solemn day of humiliation was imposed through the whole bounds of the presbytery, for the sake of the afflicted family. Whether it was owing to this or not, there ensued an alleviation from that time till April, and from April till August they were entirely free, and hoped all was over. But then it began again, worse than ever, and they were dreadfully tormented through the autumn, after which the disturbance ceased, and although the family lived in the house many years afterward, nothing of the sort ever happened again. End of section 24. Recording by Warren Cotty, Gurnee, Illinois.